It began with the discovery of a sealed tomb in Medina, believed to belong to one of Islam's fiercest early opponents, Abu Lahab. But what British scientists found inside didn't confirm hostility. It revealed a hidden truth that would shake their convictions to the core. Thousands of them would walk in skeptics and leave as Muslims. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cambridge University campus as Dr. Margaret Thornfield hurried toward the Department of Archaeological Sciences. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp October air, and her mind raced with the implications of the phone call she'd received barely an hour earlier. Professor Hassan al-Mahmoud, the renowned Islamic historian from Oxford, had contacted her with what he described as the most significant archaeological discovery of our generation. Margaret had built her career on skepticism. 23 years of excavating Roman settlements and analyzing pottery fragments had taught her to approach extraordinary claims with measured caution. Yet something in Hassan's voice, a tremor of barely contained excitement mixed with profound bewilderment, had compelled her to clear her schedule immediately. She found Hassan waiting in her office, pacing between her towering bookshelves with the restless energy of a man who hadn't slept. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his silver beard unkempt, and his eyes held a wild gleam that Margaret had never seen before. "Hassan, you look terrible," she said, setting down her coffee and gesturing toward the worn leather chair across from her desk. "What's this about?" Hassan collapsed into the chair and ran his hands through his hair. "Margaret, I need you to promise me something before I begin. Promise me you'll hear everything I have to say before you make any judgments." "You're scaring me. Promise me." Margaret studied her colleague's face. She had known Hassan for over a decade, had collaborated with him on numerous projects spanning the intersection of archaeology and Islamic history. He was methodical, rational, and utterly reliable. To see him in such a state was profoundly unsettling. "I promise," she said quietly. Hassan reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a thick manila folder. His hands shook slightly as he placed it on Margaret's desk. 3 weeks ago, a construction crew in Medina was breaking ground for a new hospital wing. They uncovered what appeared to be an ancient burial site. The Saudi authorities immediately called in our archaeological team from the University of Riyadh. Margaret nodded. This was standard procedure for any historical discovery in Saudi Arabia. "What we found defied explanation," Hassan continued. "The burial chamber was intact, sealed for over 14 centuries. But that's not the remarkable part." He opened the folder and withdrew a series of photographs. The inscriptions on the tomb were unlike anything we'd ever encountered. They appeared to be in Arabic, but using a script that predated the standardization of Arabic writing by several decades. Margaret examined the photographs. Even in the harsh light of archaeological photography, she could see that the inscriptions were extraordinarily well preserved. The stonework was exquisite, far more sophisticated than typical 7th century craftsmanship. "We brought in linguistic experts from across the Middle East," Hassan said. "It took 2 weeks to decipher the inscriptions, but when we did—" He paused, his voice catching. "Margaret, the tomb belongs to Abu Lahab." Margaret looked up sharply. Even with her limited knowledge of Islamic history, she recognized the name. Abu Lahab was the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, mentioned specifically in the Quran as one of the Prophet's fiercest opponents. According to Islamic tradition, an entire chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Masad, had been revealed concerning Abu Lahab and his wife, prophesying their punishment in the afterlife. "That's significant," Margaret said carefully. "But I don't understand why you're so—" "There's more," Hassan interrupted, pulling out additional photographs. "We found extensive written records buried with the body. Personal journals, correspondence, religious writings. All in Abu Lahab's own hand, authenticated through multiple independent analyses. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What do they say? Hassan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. They tell a completely different story than what we thought we knew. According to these documents, Abu Lahab didn't die as an enemy of Islam. He converted Margaret, in secret, during the final years of his life. The journals detail his gradual acceptance of his nephew's message, his growing conviction that Muhammad was indeed a prophet of God. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Hassan was correct, it would mean that one of the most reviled figures in Islamic history had actually embraced the faith he was known for opposing. It would call into question fundamental assumptions about early Islamic history. Hassan, that would be extraordinary if true. But surely you understand why I'd be skeptical. The potential for forgery. We thought the same thing, Hassan said, his voice gaining strength. That's why I called in every expert I could find. Carbon dating confirms the age of the materials. Forensic analysis of the ink and papyrus shows no signs of modern intervention. Linguistic analysis confirms the writing patterns are consistent with 7th century Arabic. We even brought in specialists in historical forgery from Scotland Yard. He leaned forward intensely. Margaret, I've spent my entire career studying this period. I know every major forgery attempt from the last 2 centuries. This isn't fake. We've subjected these documents to every conceivable test, and they all point to the same conclusion. Margaret felt her scientific worldview shifting beneath her feet. If Hassan was right, they weren't just looking at an archaeological discovery. They were looking at evidence that would fundamentally alter understanding of Islamic history, and by extension, the religious beliefs of over 1 billion people. What does this mean? She asked. Hassan stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling campus. I don't know. But I know we can't ignore it. That's why I'm here. I need your help, Margaret. I need the most skeptical, thorough archaeological mind I know to examine this evidence independently. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, processing what she'd heard. Finally, she looked up at Hassan. When do we leave for Saudi Arabia? The flight to Riyadh gave Margaret 18 hours to study Hassan's preliminary findings. She pored over photographs, translation notes, and scientific analysis reports, her trained eye searching for any inconsistency or sign of deception. By the time they landed, she had to admit that the evidence appeared compelling, though she reserved final judgment until she could examine the materials personally. Dr. Amara Qasemi, the lead archaeologist from the University of Riyadh, met them at the site. She was a small, intense woman in her 40s, whose reputation for meticulous scholarship preceded her. Margaret had read several of Amara's papers on early Islamic archaeology and respected her work immensely. Dr. Thornfield, Amara said, shaking Margaret's hand firmly. I'm honored to have you here. I must admit, I was hoping you'd find some flaw in our analysis that we'd missed. This discovery has been challenging for all of us. The burial site was located in a restricted area outside Medina, surrounded by security barriers and guarded by Saudi officials. As they approached the excavation tent, Margaret could see why such precautions were necessary. If word of this discovery leaked prematurely, it could cause tremendous upheaval throughout the Islamic world. Inside the climate-controlled tent, Margaret got her first look at Abu Lahab's tomb. The burial chamber was remarkably well preserved, protected by layers of stone and sealed with a technique that had kept moisture and decay at bay for 14 centuries. The inscriptions Hassan had shown her were even more impressive in person, carved with a precision and artistry that spoke of tremendous reverence for the deceased. We've photographed and documented everything exactly as we found it, Amara explained as they descended into the chamber. The body was wrapped in silk shrouds, surrounded by personal possessions and the written materials Dr. Al-Mahmoud described to you. Margaret knelt beside the display cases containing Abu Lahab's journals and correspondence. Even through the protective glass, she could see the elegant Arabic script, the careful formation of each letter. The papyrus showed signs of age, but remained remarkably legible. "May I see the translations?" she asked. Amara handed her a thick binder. "We've had 3 independent translation teams work on these documents. Their renderings are remarkably consistent." Margaret opened the binder and began reading. The first entry was dated to what would correspond to 629 CE, roughly 2 years before Abu Lahab's historically recorded death. The tone was reflective, almost melancholy. "I have lived my life in opposition to my nephew, certain that his claims were the delusions of an ambitious man. But in recent months, I find myself questioning everything I believed. The changes I see in those who follow him, the peace in their faces, the joy in their worship, the way they care for one another, these are not the fruits of deception." Margaret continued reading, her astonishment growing with each entry. The journals chronicled Abu Lahab's gradual spiritual transformation, his wrestling with doubt and pride, his growing recognition of what he came to believe was divine truth in his nephew's message. One entry, dated several months later, was particularly striking. "I performed the ritual washing today and spoke the words that Muhammad taught his followers. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. As the words left my lips, I felt a weight lift from my heart that I had carried for years. I am no longer the enemy of my nephew's God. I am his servant, though the world will never know it." Margaret looked up at Hassan and Amara, both of whom were watching her reaction carefully. If authentic, this changes everything we thought we knew about this period. "That's what we've been grappling with," Amara said. "But there's more. Show her the correspondence, Hassan." Hassan directed Margaret to another section of the binder. Here were letters, apparently exchanged between Abu Lahab and various early Muslim leaders. Most shocking were several letters that appeared to be from the Prophet Muhammad himself, written in response to secret communications from his uncle. One letter was particularly poignant. "My beloved uncle, your letter brought tears of joy to my eyes. I have prayed for your guidance since I first received the revelation, knowing that your opposition pained me more than any other. That you have found your way to the truth fills my heart with gratitude to Allah. You ask why you must keep your conversion secret, and I understand your wisdom in this. The time may come when the truth can be revealed, but for now, Allah knows what is in your heart, and that is sufficient." Margaret set down the binder, her hands trembling slightly. "Have you consulted with Islamic scholars about these findings?" "We brought in Dr. Mahmoud al-Ansari from Al-Azhar University," Amara replied. "He's one of the most respected Quranic scholars in the world. His initial reaction was much like yours, skepticism followed by amazement. He's asked for time to study the theological implications." "What did he say about the contradiction with the Quran?" Margaret asked. "Surah Al-Masad specifically mentions Abu Lahab's condemnation." Hassan nodded gravely. "That's the heart of the theological problem. Dr. Al-Ansari pointed out that the Quran's prophecy about Abu Lahab's fate was meant to demonstrate divine knowledge, that God knew Abu Lahab would never convert, even though he had the opportunity to do so. If these documents are authentic, it raises profound questions about Quranic interpretation." Margaret spent 3 days at the site, examining every aspect of the discovery with the thoroughness that had made her reputation. She supervised additional carbon dating tests, analyzed the composition of the inks and materials, and even brought in her own handwriting experts from Cambridge. Every test confirmed the authenticity of the find. On her final evening in Saudi Arabia, Margaret sat alone in her hotel room, staring out at the lights of Riyadh. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the implications were staggering. If these documents were genuine, and every scientific test suggested they were, then a fundamental assumption about Islamic history was wrong. She thought about her own relationship with faith. Raised Anglican but lapsed for decades, Margaret had always viewed religion with the detached interest of an academic studying ancient civilizations. She appreciated the historical significance of religious movements, the archaeological evidence of human spiritual yearning, but had never felt personally moved by any particular faith. Yet something about Abu Lahab's journals had touched her deeply. The raw honesty of his spiritual struggle, the courage required to embrace a truth that contradicted everything he had publicly professed, the quiet dignity of his private conversion. It spoke to something in Margaret that she hadn't known existed. She picked up her phone and called her research assistant back at Cambridge. "David, I need you to clear my schedule for the next month, and I want you to contact Dr. Sarah Williams in the Department of Religious Studies. Tell her I need to speak with her about Islamic theology." Word of the discovery spread slowly through academic circles, shared in confidence among a small group of trusted scholars. Margaret returned to Cambridge and began the most intensive research project of her career, diving deep into Islamic history, theology, and practice. She was joined by Dr. James Peterson from Oxford's Department of Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Rachel Cohen from Hebrew University's Department of Islamic Studies, and eventually by dozens of other researchers from universities across Britain and Europe. The secrecy surrounding the discovery created an unusual atmosphere of collaboration and shared wonder. Scholars who might normally compete for publication rights and academic recognition found themselves united by the magnitude of what they were studying. Late-night discussions in Cambridge libraries and Oxford common rooms took on an almost mystical quality as researchers grappled with evidence that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Dr. Peterson was the first to make the connection that would ultimately transform the entire project. While researching early Islamic conversion narratives, he discovered references in obscure historical texts to other secret conversions among the Prophet's early opponents. These references, largely ignored by previous scholars, suddenly took on new significance in light of the Abu Lahab discovery. What if this wasn't unique? Peterson asked during one of their weekly research meetings. What if there were other secret conversions among the Prophet's apparent enemies? What if the traditional narrative of early Islamic history has been oversimplified? Margaret looked up from the manuscript she was translating. "You're suggesting a pattern of hidden conversions?" "I'm suggesting we may have fundamentally misunderstood the social dynamics of early Meccan society," Peterson replied. "The Quran and traditional historical accounts present a clear division between believers and opponents. But what if the reality was more complex? What if some opposition was public performance while private conviction told a different story?" This insight opened new avenues of research. The team began re-examining traditional Islamic historical sources with fresh eyes, looking for clues that might have been missed by earlier scholars. They found them: subtle hints in classical Arabic texts, oblique references in poetry and correspondence, suggestions that the conversion process in early Islamic society was more nuanced than previously understood. Dr. Cohen made another crucial discovery while researching comparative religious conversion narratives. She found parallels in early Christian history, where public opposition to Christianity sometimes masked private sympathy or even secret conversion, particularly among politically prominent figures who couldn't afford to openly embrace the new faith. This pattern appears in multiple religious contexts, Cohen explained to the group. Political necessity often required public opposition to new religious movements, even from those who were privately sympathetic. It's entirely plausible that this dynamic existed in early Islamic society as well. As their research progressed, something unexpected began happening to the researchers themselves. Margaret was the first to notice it during a quiet evening in her study, reading through Abu Lahab's journals for perhaps the 20th time. The spiritual journey chronicled in those pages, the honest wrestling with doubt, the gradual recognition of divine truth, the peace that came with surrender to a higher purpose, began to resonate with her personally. She found herself drawn to learn more about Islamic practice and belief, not just as an academic exercise, but out of genuine spiritual curiosity. She began attending lectures on Islamic theology, reading the Quran in translation, and even visiting the local mosque during open house events. Dr. Peterson experienced a similar awakening. While researching early Islamic poetry, he encountered verses that moved him profoundly. The beauty of the Arabic language, the depth of the theological concepts, the emphasis on social justice and personal responsibility, all of it began to speak to spiritual longings he hadn't even realized he possessed. "I keep thinking about Abu Lahab's courage," Peterson confided to Margaret during one of their research sessions. Here was a man who had publicly opposed his nephew, who had built his reputation on that opposition, yet he was willing to privately acknowledge when he'd been wrong. There's something profound about that kind of intellectual and spiritual honesty. Dr. Cohen's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. As a Jewish scholar who had spent her career studying Islam academically, she had always maintained strict professional boundaries between her research and her personal beliefs. But the Abu Lahab documents forced her to confront questions about truth, revelation, and the nature of divine guidance that transcended academic categories. "I've spent years studying Islamic theology as an outsider," she told the group during one of their meetings. "But these documents have made me realize that some questions can't be answered from a purely academic perspective. They require personal engagement with the spiritual claims being made." The transformation wasn't limited to the core research team. Word of their work had spread through British academic circles, and other scholars began requesting access to their findings. Dr. Michael Harrison from the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Emma Thompson from King's College, London, Dr. Robert Clark from the University of Manchester, all came to examine the evidence and found themselves similarly affected. What emerged was an unprecedented situation in modern academic history. Dozens of respected scholars, trained in skeptical inquiry and committed to secular methodologies, found themselves personally drawn to the religious tradition they were studying. The evidence of Abu Lahab's conversion had opened a door to questions they had never seriously considered. Margaret realized the full implications of what was happening during a conversation with her mentor, Professor Emeritus David Whitmore, who had guided her graduate studies 25 years earlier. She had called him to discuss the ethical implications of their research, and he had asked to meet in person. They met at a quiet pub near Cambridge, the same place where Professor Whitmore had delivered her thesis defense verdict decades earlier. He listened intently as Margaret described their findings and the personal transformations occurring among the research team. "Margaret," he said finally, "I need to ask you something directly, and I want an honest answer. Are you considering converting to Islam?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Until that question was posed so directly, she hadn't fully acknowledged what had been growing in her heart over the past months. But as soon as the words were spoken, she knew the answer. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Professor Whitmore nodded slowly. "And how many others in your research group are having similar thoughts?" "Most of us, I think. Maybe all of us." "This is extraordinary, Margaret. In my 50 years in academia, I've never seen anything like this. Serious scholars don't typically undergo religious conversions as a result of their research." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "But isn't that exactly what should happen if the evidence leads in that direction? Isn't intellectual honesty about following the truth wherever it leads, regardless of personal comfort or professional considerations? Professor Whitmore smiled. You always were my most rigorous student. But Margaret, you understand the implications of what you're contemplating? The professional risks? The personal upheaval? I understand them, Margaret replied. But I also understand that some discoveries change everything. This isn't just an archaeological find. It's evidence that has forced me to confront fundamental questions about truth, meaning, and purpose that I've been avoiding my entire career. The conversation with Professor Whitmore crystallized Margaret's thinking. Over the following weeks, she began taking formal instruction in Islamic beliefs and practices. She wasn't alone. Dr. Peterson, Dr. Cohen, and nearly a dozen other researchers from their expanding network were doing the same. The local Islamic community was initially bewildered by the sudden influx of academic interest. The imam at the Cambridge Mosque, Dr. Abdullah Rahman, was a thoughtful man who had previously had little interaction with the university community. Suddenly, he found himself conducting regular classes for groups of professors and graduate students, all earnestly seeking to understand Islamic theology and practice. In 30 years of ministry, I have never seen anything like this, Dr. Rahman confided to Margaret after one of their study sessions. The depth of your questions, the sincerity of your seeking, it's remarkable. You approach Islam with both the rigor of scholars and the openness of genuine seekers. The formal conversion ceremony took place on a crisp December morning at the Cambridge Mosque. Margaret stood with 11 other researchers, professors from Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh, and London universities, as they formally embraced Islam. The ceremony was private, attended only by immediate family members in the local Muslim community, but its significance was profound. As Margaret spoke the words of the Shahada, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. She felt the same sense of spiritual release that Abu Lahab had described in his journals. The intellectual journey that had begun with archaeological evidence had become a personal transformation that touched the deepest levels of her being. News of the conversions began to spread through British academic circles. At first, there was skepticism and even suspicion. Colleagues wondered if the researchers had been somehow deceived or manipulated. The idea that serious academics would convert to Islam based on archaeological evidence seemed almost incomprehensible to many in the secular university environment. But as more details of the Abu Lahab discovery became public, and as the converted scholars began publishing their findings in peer-reviewed journals, the broader academic community was forced to take their claims seriously. The evidence was subjected to increasingly rigorous scrutiny, but it continued to withstand every challenge. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, now Maryam Abdullah Thornfield, found herself at the center of intense media attention. Television interviews, newspaper profiles, and academic conferences all wanted to understand how a respected archaeologist had come to embrace Islam. Her response was always the same. She had simply followed the evidence where it led. Science and faith are not necessarily in opposition, she explained to a BBC interviewer. In this case, scientific investigation led me to evidence that supported religious claims. As a scholar, I couldn't ignore that evidence simply because it challenged my preconceptions. The publication of their findings in the journal Archaeological Sciences created an international sensation. The peer review process had been exhaustive, with independent verification of every claim. When the article finally appeared, it was accompanied by an unprecedented editorial statement acknowledging the profound implications of the research. The response from the Islamic world was complex and varied. Some scholars and leaders celebrated the discovery as vindication of Islamic truth claims. Others worried about the theological implications of evidence that seemed to contradict traditional interpretations of Quranic verses. Still others questioned whether the conversions of Western scholars represented genuine faith or academic curiosity taken too far. Dr. Mahmoud al-Ansari, the Quranic scholar from Al-Azhar who had first examined the documents, published a thoughtful analysis that attempted to address some of the theological concerns. He argued that the Abu Lahab discovery didn't contradict the Quran, but rather deepened understanding of divine mercy and the complexity of human spiritual journeys. The Quran speaks of God's knowledge encompassing all things, Dr. al-Ansari wrote. Perhaps what we are seeing in these documents is evidence of divine mercy extending even to those who appear to be enemies of the faith. Abu Lahab's secret conversion reminds us that God's guidance can reach any heart at any time. The broader impact of the discovery extended far beyond academic and religious circles. The story of British scientists converting to Islam after studying archaeological evidence captured public imagination worldwide. It became a symbol of intellectual honesty, transcending cultural and religious boundaries, of the power of evidence to change minds, and of the ongoing relevance of ancient wisdom in the modern world. Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey during her first Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, 18 months after her conversion. Standing in the Grand Mosque, surrounded by millions of Muslims from every corner of the world, she thought about Abu Lahab and the courage he had shown in acknowledging truth despite the personal cost. The pilgrimage had drawn extensive media coverage due to the presence of the converted British scholars. Margaret and her colleagues had tried to maintain focus on the spiritual significance of their journey, but they understood that their presence carried symbolic weight that extended beyond their personal faith journeys. On the final day of Hajj, as Margaret stood on the plain of Arafat, listening to the sermon delivered to the gathered multitude, she was struck by the continuity between past and present. 14 centuries earlier, Abu Lahab had struggled with the same fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and divine truth that had brought her to Islam. His secret journey of faith had become, through the mystery of archaeological discovery, a bridge connecting contemporary seekers with the earliest days of Islamic history. The long-term implications of the Abu Lahab discovery continued to unfold. Universities across Britain began offering new courses examining the intersection of archaeological evidence and religious belief. The conversion of prominent academics opened new dialogues between secular and religious communities, challenging assumptions about the compatibility of rigorous scholarship and personal faith. Margaret established the Institute for Archaeological Theology at Cambridge, dedicated to investigating how archaeological discoveries might inform religious understanding. The Institute attracted researchers from multiple faith traditions and became a model for interdisciplinary religious scholarship grounded in empirical evidence. Dr. Peterson founded a similar program at Oxford, focused on early Islamic history, while Dr. Cohen's work on comparative religious conversion narratives opened new fields of study in religious studies departments across Europe. Their scholarly output continued to be rigorous and well respected, but now carried the additional dimension of personal spiritual engagement with the material. The conversions also had a profound impact on the British Muslim community. The sight of respected academics embracing Islam provided encouragement to young Muslims who sometimes felt caught between their faith and their secular education. It demonstrated that intellectual rigor and religious conviction could be mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. As the 5th anniversary of the Abu Lahab discovery approached, Margaret was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Archaeology and Religion in London. She spent weeks preparing her remarks, knowing that this would be an opportunity to reflect on how the discovery had changed not just individual lives, but entire fields of study. Standing before an audience of hundreds of researchers, religious leaders, and students from around the world, Margaret began her address by returning to the fundamental question that had driven their investigation. What do we do when evidence challenges our deepest assumptions about truth. She spoke about the courage required to follow evidence even when it leads to uncomfortable conclusions, about the responsibility of scholars to remain open to discoveries that transcend their preconceptions, and about the unexpected ways that academic investigation can become spiritual journey. The Abu Lahab discovery taught us that the boundaries between different types of truth, historical, scientific, spiritual, are more porous than we imagined, Margaret said. It reminded us that human beings have been wrestling with questions of meaning and purpose for millennia, and that sometimes the most ancient voices can speak with startling relevance to contemporary seekers. She concluded her address by reflecting on the ongoing nature of discovery, both scientific and spiritual. Our investigation of Abu Lahab's tomb opened questions that extend far beyond archaeology or Islamic history. It raised fundamental questions about the nature of conversion, the relationship between public identity and private belief, and the ways that divine guidance might work in human lives across centuries and cultures. The applause that followed was sustained and respectful, but Margaret knew that the real measure of their work's success wasn't academic recognition. It was the transformation of lives, her own and those of her colleagues, and the ongoing conversation between faith and reason that their discovery had initiated. As she left the podium, Margaret caught sight of Dr. Rahman, the imam who had guided her early studies of Islam, sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes. Later, at the reception, he approached her with a warm embrace. "Sister Mariam," he said using her chosen Islamic name, "when you first came to our mosque 5 years ago, I never imagined where your questions would lead. But I see now that Allah had a plan that none of us could have anticipated." Margaret smiled, thinking of Abu Lahab's journals and the long journey from ancient Medina to contemporary Cambridge that had brought her to this moment. "The most important discoveries," she replied, "are often the ones we never expected to make." The story of the Abu Lahab tomb and the subsequent conversions continued to resonate in unexpected ways. Documentary filmmakers, novelists, and playwrights all found inspiration in the narrative of scholars whose pursuit of historical truth had led them to personal transformation. The discovery became a touchstone for discussions about the relationship between reason and faith, the power of evidence to change minds, and the ongoing relevance of ancient wisdom. But for Margaret and her colleagues, the most significant outcome wasn't the public attention or academic recognition. It was the quiet satisfaction of having followed truth wherever it led, even when that path required abandoning comfortable assumptions and embracing new ways of understanding the world. In her private moments, Margaret often returned to Abu Lahab's final journal entry, written just weeks before his death. "I have lived 2 lives, one in public as the enemy of my nephew's message, one in private as a servant of his God. History will remember only the first, but God knows the second. In the end, it is God's knowledge that matters. I pray that someday, when the time is right, the truth of my journey will serve as guidance for others who struggle as I have struggled." 14 centuries later, Abu Lahab's prayer had been answered in ways he could never have imagined. His secret journey of faith had become a bridge between past and present, between skepticism and belief, between the academic pursuit of truth and the personal quest for meaning. Through the mystery of archaeological discovery and the courage of contemporary seekers, his story had become a testament to the power of evidence to transform understanding and the endless capacity of human hearts to recognize truth, regardless of when or how it is revealed. The thousands of British scientists who embraced Islam following the Abu Lahab discovery would always carry within them the recognition that some questions transcend academic categories. that some evidence demands not just intellectual assent, but personal response, and that the most profound discoveries are often those that change not just what we know, but who we are.